So during the Clone Wars, we see a lot of one particular vessel utilized by the Republic, the Venator-Class Star Destroyer. And while we see a lot of how the Republic used them, the Empire actually did use them for a little bit of time following the end of the war. So I figured today we'll take a look at exactly how the Empire utilized the Venators that they had left over from the Republic Navy. I'm Colin, and this is Sci-Fi Deep Dive. Remember, if you enjoyed this video, to head down below and hit that subscribe button. So during the Clone Wars, the Galactic Republic built a vast fleet of their sort of carrier battleship hybrids, the Venator-Class Star Destroyers. And these Star Destroyers became an icon of the Republic, seen in nearly every space battle throughout the duration of the Clone Wars. But at the end of the Clone Wars, Palpatine declared a new order, and the Republic was reorganized into the Galactic Empire. With the war over and such a massive fleet seemingly irrelevant, what happened to all of these Venator-Class Star Destroyers? As I've mentioned, a lot of Venators ended up in scrapyards, and ultimately, all of them did, but not immediately. As we see in the Bad Batch, the Empire did continue to utilize them for a while, and it does appear, at least at the end of Revenge of the Sith, that they would stay in service for a significant amount of time, long enough to warrant a new paint job at least. So how exactly did the Empire utilize these massive ships? Well, let's start with the obvious. They could serve as mainline warships for a short period of time. After all, the Imperial-Class Star Destroyer was likely in the very early stages of production at this time, with only a few out around in the galaxy. After all, the Empire needed a fleet. They needed to maintain control of the galaxy. Well, we see in the Bad Batch that they are still serving as mainline warships, at least within the first few months following the end of the war, but likely the first year or two. After all, they had this massive, sprawling fleet of Venators left over from the end of the war, and, they're a good warship to sort of hold the Empire over for the meantime. Venators, however, didn't really fit the Imperial doctrine very well. It was fairly early on in the reign of the Empire that the Empire adopted the Tarkin doctrine as a main principle of their military strategy. Basically, the idea was they wanted the biggest, most imposing force, not necessarily the most effective. Basically, having this big, imposing force could terrify anyone into submission. Now, the Venator unfortunately didn't really fit that role very well. While it was a large and impressive warship, it wasn't absolutely massive like an Imperial-Class Star Destroyer. And the last thing kind of working against the Venator as a mainline ship is its history. The Venator was this sort of icon of the Republic during the Clone Wars, and in a lot of cases, seeing a Venator was the first sign that your planet was about to be liberated. And while that worked in favor of the Republic, the Empire is, at this time, trying to distance themselves from the imagery tied to the Republic. So, abandoning something like the Venator makes perfect sense. Then, did they all go to the scrapyard? Well, not quite. While a lot of them did make their way to scrapyards, some Venators found themselves defending less important outposts and chunks of the galaxy that didn't necessarily warrant Imperial-Class Star Destroyers. But as time wore on, the Venator became less and less effective and less necessary. The Empire was building more and more newer, more modern ships, particularly ships that really fit the Imperial doctrine, things like the Imperial-Class Star Destroyer, and the Venators simply became unnecessary. But there is one key use that I've always thought the Venator would be perfect for, and I would be really surprised if the Empire didn't utilize them for this purpose, at least for a little while. The Venator is a great training ship. You see, unlike the Imperial-Class Star Destroyer, which ultimately has one command bridge, the Venator actually has two. Well, one of them is designed to serve more as a control tower for managing incoming and outgoing fighters. They could both fill the role of a command bridge in a crisis. So the Venator allows the very unique opportunity to train two bridge crews on a single vessel. It's totally viable to have two separate groups of officers in training commanding the Venator-Class Star Destroyer and sort of just handing off command for various lessons. But on top of that, the Venator's massive hangar space makes it a perfect training ground for Imperial fighter pilots. This allows them to get familiar with taking off and landing in a ventral hangar bay, which the Venator did have, but also allows them to land and take off from the much larger dorsal hangar bays on the Venator with their large doors and long runway, which would make it a much easier landing target for a less skilled pilot. Ultimately, though, by the time of Star Wars Rebels and the sort of early days of the Rebel Alliance, the Venator was entirely retired. In fact, it appears like 5 years after the end of the Clone Wars, the Venator has really almost completely been phased out, with only a handful here and there. But there is one Republic ship that did stick around throughout the reign of the Empire, and that's the Arquitens-Class Light Cruiser. If you want to learn more about the Arquitens-Class Light Cruiser, I'll leave a link up here to my video on that. And I want you to let me know down in the comments what you think of my training ship idea. Do you think it would have been smart for the Empire to keep these ships around to train command crews and pilots, or do you think it's better to just send them to the scrapyard and train the pilots and the crews on the ground or in other types of facilities? And if you have any topics you want to see me cover in Star Wars, leave them down below in the comments. And last but not least, if you enjoyed this video, head down below, hit the like button, the subscribe button, and the bell icon so you get notified when I upload new videos. So for Sci-Fi Deep Dive, I'm Colin, and I will see you next time.